Hello everyone, and welcome. In this video, we'll be diving into the world of Power BI, focusing specifically on one of the most important concepts, data refresh and gateway. This session is brought to you by ZoomInData, your space for learning business intelligence and data analytics. So, let's get started and understand how Power BI connects to different data sources and why this process is so essential in today's data-driven world. First question: why does a dataset refresh successfully in Power BI Desktop but fail in Power BI Service? Power BI Desktop uses your local machine's credentials, file paths, VPN connection, and network environment, while the service runs in the cloud, requiring independent authentication and gateway configurations. Local data sources like Excel or CSV stored on your PC cannot be accessed by the service, causing refresh failures unless a gateway is used. Privacy levels, OAuth permissions, and token expiration behave differently in the service and often break scheduled refresh. Mismatched server names, dynamic data source paths, or unsupported connectors can work locally but not in the service environment. Second question: what happens internally during a scheduled refresh in Power BI Service? Power BI initiates a refresh request and the mashup engine re-evaluates all Power Query steps, pushing as much logic as possible back to the source, query folding. The gateway, if required, establishes a secure connection to on-prem or cloud data sources and retrieves fresh data. Power BI creates or updates partitions, ingests data into the in-memory model, VerTPAC, and replaces the old dataset cache. Once the refresh completes, reports regenerate visuals using the updated model, and Power BI updates metadata, refresh logs, and lineage views. Third question: why doesn't scheduled refresh apply to direct query and live connection models? Direct query and live connection do not store data. They query the underlying data source in real time, meaning there's nothing to refresh. Because all queries are executed at runtime, Power BI Service relies entirely on source-side performance instead of dataset refresh. Scheduled refresh is only relevant for import mode, where data is physically stored in the Power BI dataset. These modes instead use connection refresh or metadata refresh, but not data refresh. Fourth question: what is the role of partitions in incremental refresh? Partitions divide large datasets into segments such as years or months, allowing Power BI to refresh only the most recent partitions instead of the entire dataset. Older partitions become read-only and optimized, reducing refresh time and improving performance. Each refresh cycle only queries the data source for new or changed data, significantly minimizing load on both Power BI and the database. Partitioning enables advanced features like hybrid tables, combining import plus direct query for real-time analytics. Fifth question: when does incremental refresh not work even if it is enabled? When Power Query transformations break query folding, preventing the source from filtering data efficiently. When custom SQL queries, mscripts, or unsupported connectors prevent Power BI from generating partition-level queries. If range start and range end parameters are not used correctly or not referenced in filtering logic. When the source does not support datetime filtering, which is mandatory for partition creation. Sixth question: how does query folding impact refresh performance? Query folding pushes filtering, grouping, and joins back to the data source, reducing data load and improving refresh time. Incremental refresh depends on folding to create partition-specific queries. Without folding, Power BI must download all data, slowing refresh dramatically. Folding ensures that only necessary rows, example recent data, are extracted during incremental refresh. Poor or broken folding leads to slow refresh, heavy gateway load, and unnecessary database stress. 7th question. Why does Power BI disable scheduled refresh automatically? Microsoft automatically disables scheduled refresh when a dataset fails refresh multiple times consecutively to avoid resource wastage. Refresh may be disabled when credentials expire, OAuth tokens lapse, or privacy settings block source access. Unsupported sources or removed gateways cause Power BI to disable refresh until the issue is resolved. Excessive refresh frequency or exceeding service limits, example Pro refresh limit, can also cause auto-disabling. 8th question. What is the difference between a dataset cache refresh and a visual level cache refresh in Power BI? A dataset cache refresh updates the underlying data model stored in Power BI service, ensuring the semantic model contains fresh data. A visual level cache refresh refreshes only the displayed visuals, pulling updated values from the already refreshed dataset cache. Visual cache refresh occurs automatically when users interact with the report or when cache expiration is reached. Dataset refresh affects all reports based on the model. Visual cache refresh only affects what is shown to the user at that moment. 9th question. Your scheduled refresh succeeded, but the visuals in the report still show old data. Why does this happen? The dataset cache may have refreshed, but the visual cache is still showing previously cached visual results, which take time to expire or refresh during user interaction. Power BI may be using a browser-level or report-level cached version if the report hasn't been reopened or refreshed after the dataset update. If the model uses calculated tables or measures that depend on date time, they might not recalculate until the report is requeried. If a semantic model is used across multiple reports, a report may be pointing to an older dataset version due to workspace duplication or copy versions. 10th question. A dataset refresh takes 40+ minutes. How do you optimize it? Review the Power Query steps to ensure query folding is maintained, reducing the amount of data pulled from the source. Implement incremental refresh so only recent data is refreshed instead of always refreshing the entire dataset. Remove unnecessary columns, decrease cardinality, and eliminate heavy transformations to optimize the VertiPack memory load. If a gateway is used, consider gateway performance. Increase CPU, scale up RAM, or cluster the gateway to reduce single node overload. 11th question. You published a report with a local Excel or CSV file and refresh fails in Power BI service. Why? Local files exist only on your machine, and Power BI service cannot access local file paths such as C drive or D drive after publishing. A gateway is required to access on-premise data sources. Without it, the service cannot reach the local file for refresh. Even if a gateway is installed, the file path mapped in desktop must match the exact path in the gateway configuration, or refresh will fail. Cloud alternatives like OneDrive or SharePoint auto-sync files and avoid refresh failures caused by local file dependencies. 12th question. How would you design an optimal refresh strategy for a 200 million+ row fact table? Enable incremental refresh with proper range start and range end filters to refresh only recent partitions while keeping historical data static. Use partitioning logic such as yearly or monthly partitions, depending on data volume, so refresh time remains stable and predictable. Move the table to a data warehouse or lakehouse optimized for Power BI, ensuring folding is supported and transformations are minimal. Implement hybrid tables, available in Premium, for near real-time data, using import mode for history and direct query for today's data. 13th question. Refresh fails only during peak hours. What should you investigate? Check database performance during peak hours, since the source system may be too busy, causing timeouts or connection throttling. The gateway machine may be overloaded during working hours, causing delays or limited resources for refresh operations. Network congestion or firewall throttling during peak office hours may interrupt cloud to on-premise communication. If the refresh schedule overlaps with other datasets, it may cause resource contention, especially in shared capacity or heavily loaded premium capacities. 14th question. You need different refresh frequencies for different tables inside the same model. How do you achieve this? Use incremental refresh to refresh only partitions of the time-sensitive table and keep other tables static. Implement hybrid tables where part of the data is direct query and part is import, allowing near real-time refresh only for required tables. Split the tables into separate semantic models and combine them using composite models, giving each model its own refresh schedule. Leverage direct query for frequently changing tables and keep slower tables in import mode. 15th question. Incremental refresh is enabled, but Power BI still performs a full refresh. Why? Query folding is broken, forcing Power BI to retrieve the entire dataset instead of pushing filters to the source. Range start and range end parameters were created but not applied as actual filters in Power Query, preventing partition creation. The first refresh after publishing is always a full historical load. Only subsequent refreshes become incremental. Using custom SQL queries or unsupported connectors stops Power BI from generating partition-based queries, causing a full refresh every time. 16th question. Why should a personal gateway not be used in production? A personal gateway runs under the logged-in user's credentials, meaning refresh will fail whenever the user logs out, shuts down their machine, or loses connectivity. It cannot be shared with teams or administrators, making it unsuitable for enterprise scenarios where multiple owners must manage refresh and data sources. Personal gateways do not support advanced enterprise features like high availability, gateway clusters, or centralized monitoring. They rely on the user's local machine performance, which introduces instability and refresh delays compared to server-grade enterprise gateway setups. 17th question. Explain gateway mapping and how mismatches cause refresh failures. Gateway mapping links your Power BI data source credentials to the corresponding on-premise server connection defined in the gateway. If the connection details in the dataset, such as server name, database, or authentication type, do not exactly match those configured in the gateway, Power BI flags the data source as not configured correctly. Even small differences like case sensitivity, instance names, or missing parameters can break mapping and cause scheduled refresh to fail. Correct mapping ensures Power BI can route queries to the correct on-premise data source through the gateway securely. 18th question. How does gateway clustering, also called high availability, work internally? A gateway cluster contains multiple gateways connected to the same cluster key, allowing the Power BI service to treat them as a single logical gateway. Power BI uses an auto-load balancing approach, routing queries to whichever gateway is available and least loaded at refresh time. If one gateway fails or is offline, the service automatically switches to another node in the cluster, ensuring zero downtime and continuous refresh. Clustering increases overall throughput because refresh tasks can be distributed across multiple machines instead of running on a single gateway. 19th question. What is the mashup engine inside a gateway and why is it crucial? The mashup engine is the same engine used by Power Query, but it runs on the gateway machine to execute M transformations during refresh. It processes all the steps defined in Power Query, including joins, filters, merges, and custom functions, before sending clean data to Power BI. Heavy transformations done through the mashup engine can overload the gateway, so suboptimal Power Query code directly affects refresh performance. Offloading transformations to the source system or using query folding reduces the load on the mashup engine and improves refresh success rates. 20th question. How does Power BI choose which gateway to use? If multiple gateway clusters are available, Power BI first checks which cluster is explicitly mapped to the dataset's data source. Within a cluster, the service looks for a gateway that is online, healthy, and least busy, based on heartbeat signals and current workload. If multiple gateways qualify, Power BI distributes refresh jobs using an internal load balancing algorithm to avoid overloading a single node. If no suitable gateway is found, the dataset becomes not connected, and refresh automatically fails until a matching gateway is available. 21st question. Why does an enterprise gateway override dataset level settings sometimes? Enterprise gateway enforces centralized connection rules, so organization-level security or authentication policies may override dataset-specific credentials. If administrators configure a gateway data source to use a specific authentication method, e.g., Windows Auth, the dataset cannot override it using different credentials. Gateway administrators may enforce query folding or network policies that change how Power BI interacts with on-prem systems, ignoring some model settings. The goal is to maintain consistent security, governance, and compliance, ensuring dataset authors cannot bypass enterprise data access policies. 22nd question. What are gateway concurrency limits and how do you optimize them? Each gateway has a default limit on how many queries it can process simultaneously. Exceeding this limit causes queued jobs and delayed refreshes. Increasing RAM and CPU on the gateway server improves concurrency because the gateway can process more parallel mashups without throttling. Splitting large models into smaller datasets or using incremental refresh reduces the refresh load and prevents concurrency bottlenecks. For heavy workloads, adding more nodes to the cluster ensures tasks are spread across machines, significantly increasing the concurrency capacity. 23rd question. Gateway is online but the dataset shows, not configured. What do you check? The first step is to verify whether the dataset's data source settings exactly match the data source definitions in the gateway, server name, database name, authentication type. Any mismatch will cause Power BI to mark the dataset as not configured. Check if the required data sources are added inside the gateway under Manage Gateways. If a source used in Power Query is missing, Power BI cannot bind the dataset to that gateway. Confirm that credential types, Windows, Basic, OAuth, on the dataset match what the gateway supports. Unsupported or wrong credentials stop mapping immediately. If parameters are used in Power Query, verify that the parameter values also match gateway data source definitions, because inconsistent parameter values stop mapping even when the gateway is online. 24th question. A gateway admin left the company. How do you recover access? A Power BI service administrator or global admin can go to Manage Gateways and reassign the gateway by adding a new admin from the organization's Active Directory. If the gateway used organizational credentials, not personal, it continues working, and the new admin can simply take ownership and update data source permissions. If the gateway key is lost, you can reinstall the gateway using the Restore from Backup Key option provided the backup key was saved earlier. If no backup exists, a new gateway installation may be required, and all datasets must be remapped to the new gateway, which should be documented beforehand for faster recovery. 25th question. Data source moved to a new server. How do you update the gateway properly? Update the gateway data source settings with the new server name and database in Manage Gateways, ensuring it matches exactly with the dataset, then Settings, then Data Source Info. Update the Power Query connection strings in Desktop and republish the updated PBIX, because refreshing will fail if Power Query still points to the old server. Confirm that credentials work on the new server and test the connection from the gateway panel to make sure network or firewall rules allow access. If the server path was parameterized, update the parameter value in Power BI service and ensure the gateway recognizes the new parameter as a supported mapping. 26th question. You want to distribute workloads across multiple gateways. How? Use gateway clusters, where multiple gateway machines are added to the same cluster key. Power BI automatically load balances refresh queries across nodes. Create separate gateway clusters per department or workload, and assign specific datasets to specific clusters to distribute processing evenly. For extremely large models, split datasets by subject areas, example sales, finance, and map each to different gateway clusters to avoid single-point overload. Monitor gateway performance using the Gateway Health and Monitoring app and add more nodes to clusters where refresh queue time is high. 27th question. Gateway CPU is at 90% and refresh delays are increasing. What is your action plan? Start by reviewing refresh history to see which datasets cause spikes and optimize them by improving query folding, reducing model size, and minimizing heavy M transformations. Scale the gateway machine by increasing CPU and RAM, because the mashup engine heavily depends on memory and parallel CPU threads. Move the gateway into a cluster with additional nodes, distributing parallel refresh tasks and preventing a single machine from becoming saturated. Avoid forcing full refreshes. Enable incremental refresh to reduce how much data the gateway needs to process each cycle. 28th question. Dataset uses two different on-prem sources. How do you configure mapping correctly? Add both data sources separately inside the gateway with complete, matching details for each source, example SQL Server plus SAP, or SQL Server plus FileShare. Ensure that the connection details in Power Query match the gateway data source entries exactly, especially if parameters or dynamic paths are used. Map each data source under Dataset Settings, then Gateway Connection, ensuring both sources show a green, configured correctly, status. Use a single gateway cluster that has access to all required on-prem systems, because multi-source datasets cannot split refresh across multiple unrelated gateways. 29th question. How do you migrate a gateway from one machine to another without breaking datasets? First, export the gateway recovery key from the old machine or ensure you have it stored. This key is required for restoring the gateway on the new machine. Install the gateway on the new machine using the Restore option, entering the same recovery key. This automatically brings all data sources and mappings to the new machine. Restart or shut down the old gateway after the new one is verified to prevent duplicate heartbeats, which can confuse refresh scheduling. Test a few dataset refreshes to confirm the new machine has the same network access, firewall rules, and authentication permissions as the old gateway. 30th question. Why must credentials be set again after publishing a report to Power BI service? Power BI Desktop stores credentials locally and only for preview purposes, but these credentials are not transferred to the Power BI service for security and compliance reasons. The service requires credentials to be entered again because it must authenticate using cloud-based identity standards, which may differ from desktop authentication methods. Scheduled refresh relies on encrypted, cloud-stored credentials, which must be explicitly set and validated inside the service. The service also needs to verify that credentials are compatible with gateways and the chosen authentication method before enabling automatic refresh. 31st question. Why is OAuth 2 authentication problematic for scheduled refresh? OAuth 2 tokens frequently expire or require interactive re-authentication, which cannot be performed by an automated scheduled refresh process. Many OAuth 2 flows involve consent screens, browser redirects, or MFA prompts, none of which can be handled by background processes. OAuth-based connectors often require a user context, making them unsuitable for unattended service-to-service authentication. Some OAuth providers enforce strict token lifetimes, causing refresh failures unless the user manually re-authenticates periodically. 32nd question. What is the difference between organizational versus public authentication in Power BI? Organizational authentication uses Azure AD to validate corporate identities, allowing Power BI to enforce security policies, MFA, RLS, and access restrictions. Public authentication is anonymous or open access and does not require user identity verification. It is used mainly for public or unrestricted data sources. Organizational authentication supports enterprise connectors such as SharePoint, SQL Azure, and Dynamics, while public mode is unsuitable for confidential data. Many secured APIs or sites block public authentication entirely to prevent unauthorized data access. 33rd question. How are credentials encrypted and stored in Power BI? Credentials entered in the Power BI service are encrypted using Azure Key Vault-based encryption, ensuring they are protected at rest and in transit. These credentials are stored in a secure token store and are only decrypted temporarily by the Power BI backend refresh service during execution. For gateway-based connections, credentials are encrypted again using the gateway's local encryption key, ensuring double-layer protection. Microsoft uses industry-standard FIPS 140-2 compliant encryption algorithms, making credential storage enterprise secure and audit safe. 34th question. How do privacy levels impact refresh, especially with gateways? Privacy levels determine how Power BI can combine data from different sources, preventing sensitive data from leaking between unrelated domains. When privacy levels conflict, example mixing private plus public sources, Power BI isolates queries, which can slow down refresh or block it entirely. Gateways enforce privacy levels by default, meaning a mismatched privacy configuration in Power Query can cause refresh failures in the service. Incorrect privacy settings often break query folding, forcing Power BI to download full datasets locally, increasing refresh time dramatically. 35th question. How does MFA, multi-factor authentication, affect scheduled refresh? MFA requires user interaction, OTP, mobile approval, or biometrics, which automated scheduled refreshes cannot perform. Once an MFA verified token expires, Power BI service cannot renew it automatically, causing refresh failures. To avoid MFA issues, enterprises typically use service principals or gateway-based credentials, both of which bypass MFA requirements. MFA is excellent for security but unsuitable for unattended or automated data refresh scenarios. 36th question. How do service principals authenticate for automated refresh? Service principals authenticate using client ID plus client secret, or certificate, allowing fully automated, non-interactive authentication for refresh operations. They bypass MFA and user login flows, making them ideal for enterprise automation, C or CD pipelines, and reliable scheduled refresh. Service principals must be explicitly enabled in the Power BI admin portal and granted workspace roles such as member or admin. Once configured, the refresh process uses Azure AD app permissions instead of user identity, ensuring stable long-term authentication. 37th question. Why does a dataset show invalid credentials, even when the credentials entered are correct? Sometimes the credential type selected in Power BI, example, Windows, Basic, or Auth2, does not match what the data source actually requires, causing Power BI to reject the attempt even though the username and password are valid. Metadata level mismatches can occur, such as when the server, database, or protocol, HTTP or HTTPS, was changed in Power Query but not updated in the gateway mapping. The test connection may fail due to firewall restrictions or server rules blocking the Power BI gateway IPs, making it appear like a credential issue. If the dataset was originally published with a different privacy level, cached credentials conflict with new ones and must be cleared and re-entered. 38th question. Why does refresh fail after switching the source from HTTP to HTTPS? Power BI treats HTTP and HTTPS as two different data sources, so credentials must be re-entered for the new HTTPS endpoint. Gateway mapping breaks because the old HTTP URL no longer matches the HTTPS endpoint defined in the dataset. Some HTTPS endpoints require updated authentication methods or certificates, and missing SSL certificates can cause gateway handshake failure. The firewall may block HTTPS traffic or require additional SSL verification rules that were not necessary for HTTP. 39th question. You updated SQL Server credentials. How do you update the credentials for 25 datasets efficiently? Use the Power BI admin portal, then Data Sources, Then manage gateways to update the SQL credentials one time at the gateway data source level instead of updating per dataset. Ensure that all 25 datasets use the same gateway data source, so updating the shared connection automatically propagates to every dataset. Validate mapping and fix datasets that were mistakenly connected to different gateway sources by aligning the data source settings. Optionally use Power BI REST API to script credential updates for large-scale environments and avoid manual work. 40th question. You need to rotate credentials regularly for security compliance. What process should you follow? Maintain separate gateway data sources for each system and ensure all datasets map to these shared sources so rotating the credentials affects all dependent datasets at once. Update credentials in the gateway first, and then verify dataset refresh settings to avoid broken refresh cycles. Always rotate passwords during low traffic periods and perform a forced refresh to confirm the new credentials are functioning. Document credential rotation schedules and centralize ownership to avoid unexpected failures during refresh cycles. 41st question. How do credentials work when a dataset uses both cloud and on-prem sources, hybrid? Cloud sources, like SharePoint, OneDrive, or Dataverse, require cloud-stored credentials, while on-prem sources require credentials stored in the gateway. Power BI separates authentication pathways, so each source has its own credential setup and both must be configured correctly to allow refresh. Privacy levels must be set consistently to allow secure data merging. Otherwise, Power BI blocks the refresh because of cross-source conflicts. Mixed authentication models can cause refresh delays if OAuth tokens for cloud sources expire faster than gateway-stored credentials. 42nd question. Why do refreshes fail for API sources due to token expiration, and how do you fix it? OAuth tokens for many APIs expire after a short period, often 60 minutes, and Power BI's stored token becomes invalid during scheduled refresh. Switching to a service principal or client secret authentication gives stable, non-interactive refresh credentials. For APIs that do not support service principals, you must create a custom connector that automatically refreshes tokens for the gateway. Refresh failures also occur if API rate limits or throttling prevent token renewal, so caching results or optimizing the number of refresh calls is necessary. 43rd question. Why does enabling skip test connection solve certain credential issues? Power BI sometimes cannot perform a test connection due to firewalls, SSL restrictions, or API endpoints blocking automated connection tests, even though the actual refresh works. Skip test connection bypasses the initial validation step and allows the gateway to attempt the real refresh instead of failing prematurely. It is especially useful when connecting to APIs, parameterized URLs, or sources that require dynamic authentication during refresh. The feature allows you to configure credentials even for sources that do not support classic connection testing, ensuring the refresh process proceeds. Thank you for watching this session. If you have any questions, you are welcome to contact ZoomInData through our website, email, or phone. We're always here to support your learning journey. See you in the next video.